So today I'll be affirming the resolution that teenagers should wait until they're 18 or older to lose their virginity. So to clarify, I'm not calling for some sort of legislation or to control behavior in any sort of way, but simply that when evaluating choices, teenagers should elect to not lose their virginity until they're 18 years or older. Now, losing your virginity is the act of having your first sexual encounter, as we all know. So today I'll lay out the burdens. If pro can show that waiting to have sex until adulthood is generally the best decision for teenagers, then pro should receive your vote. And if my opponent, the con, can show that it's wiser for students to have sex prior to adulthood, or that there's a unique benefit to losing your virginity before you're 18, then my opponent, Liam, should receive your vote. So to start, just as the resolution says, these people are teenagers, and therefore they're normally the age of a high school student, and I believe that's the lens we need to look through when we're evaluating both this debate and the resolution. This brings me to my first contention, which is all the negative medical effects that arise from having losing your virginity before you're 18. So to start, there's always a risk of STDs, with the Center of Disease Control stating that STDs are at an all-time high. Teens are less than 20% of the sexually active population, but account for 50% of new STDs. Combine this with pregnancy risks, which the Department of Health and Human Services says that 24% of pregnancies every year are that of teens, and 35% of those teen pregnancies choose to have an abortion. Teen moms are open up to many negative factors, including but not limited to reduced income, reduced education, because they normally have to drop out, increased depression, higher suicide rates, higher dependency on social programs, and you see higher cases of child neglect in teenage moms. This all leads me to my second contention, that teenagers are normally not ready to have a sexually active life. So of the percentage of teens that do elect to have sex before they're 18, 70% of those in the United States say they do so without having a condom, according to the Youth Risk Behavioral Surveillance Organization, which opens the gates to all the issues I said above. Teenagers also don't have the proper education on sexual education or consent. In the United States, you're not actually mandated to have a course on consent until you're in high school, and a lot of high schools don't even offer courses on sexual education themselves. Lastly, there's the social aspect. Say a 17-year-old guy has sex with a girl, and the next day in school, she tells all of her friends that this boy has a small penis. This boy is now the subject of social abuse for the rest of his high school career, which is a part that he does not share with his collegiate or adult counterparts. Since there's an increased social dynamic, you're all forced together. You'll have to have social interaction until the day you graduate, and that's something we do not see to the same extent in college. Lastly, on top of this, high school and the later years of high school is normally the most important time of a student's life. You have to do standardized testing. You have to maintain a high GPA. You have to apply to university and apply for scholarships. And you do not need any extra social pressure or other outlier factors influencing you in such a crucial time in your life. And with that, I'll pass it to my opponent.
All right, thumbs up if you can hear me. Okay, awesome. I just want to ask you really quickly, can you define sex and what you mean specifically about losing your virginity?
Okay, so sexual intercourse is mainly what we're referring to here. So it could be something for simple as vaginal or anal penetration, or something like a blowjob or oral sex of some sort.
So you're only talking about kissing is the only thing you would allow these people to do. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is what I'm standing for. I'm not advocating that anyone in particular should go out and seek to have sex when they're below the age of 18, but rather if the opportunity presents itself and these three criteria are met, they should absolutely go for it. These criteria are as follows. Firstly, that they need to be safe, they need to be enthusiastic, and it needs to be consensual. What do I mean by safe? I mean using things in a comfortable environment, using things like condoms and contraceptives. By enthusiastic, they both need to want to do it. There are some things you consent to doing but don't necessarily want to do. For example, going to work, they should both want to do it. And thirdly, it should be consensual, which is self-explanatory. Now, if all three of those criteria are met, they should absolutely elect to have sex, regardless of their age. Now, I'm going to go into some arguments, but before that, I want to talk about some things that Chandler said. The first thing he said is that, as I just clarified, he's talking about penetrative sex and sometimes blowjobs. Notably, things like those things like blowjobs and also things like kissing can transmit STIs. There's no reason to believe why that would be a benefit for their side. Secondly, my standard is safety, which would mean that they are unlikely to be getting to STIs anyway. Thirdly, that is true at any time. You're always at risk of getting an STI unless you're practicing absolute abstinence, and there's no reason to believe otherwise that they benefit. No, you don't get to nod at this, Chandler, because you're also supporting kissing, and kissing is something that allows for transmission of STIs. And fourthly, he just quotes a bunch of statistics in there, but then provides none of the logic for those statistics. Notably, those statistics come from America, one of the worst sexual education countries in the world. I would point to things like Australia, Canada, Germany, France, England, literally any other developed country in the world has a fully formed sexual education program, and the rates of teen pregnancy and teen STIs are nowhere near the levels that Chandler just stated. So Chandler is defending right now one of the worst sexual education countries in the world, and I'm not going to stand for that in this debate. Secondly, he says that there is bad education. For example, people don't get information about sex until they're 18 years of age. What I just identified there is that America is not the typical example of that. But secondly, it also demonstrates that the thing he's caring about is the education. He doesn't care about the age of 18. Now, and importantly, the topic is that they should wait until they're 18 plus. Therefore, he must provide an argument about it specifically being that age, as opposed to the surrounding circumstances, which I can account for and have already done so. The final thing he says is social abuse. Look, I think that's a fictitious example. The kids who have sex in high school are revered as like absolute kings and gods. You know, they're like the ones who do all the cool stuff. I think Chandler's talking out of his ass there. And even if he's not, that's a risk that they take and something that they should be able to recognize in the future. In my next speech, I'll make positive arguments.
So to start, we have to talk about the examples and the burden that Liam's placing. So of course, it's not plausible for us to actually make the pro proof that 100% of the time that everybody should wait until they're 18. We call this in legal states the preponderance of evidence, where 51% of the resolution is proven true in a court case, or in the case it is, then it carries as such with the jury, and that's the way the jury normally votes. So to start, you bring up America and how we are this outlier example of STDs and of pregnancies and of sexual intercourse. Well, even in Australia, brought up the Australian Bureau of Statistics actually states that 55% of Australian teenagers that actually have sex while they're still in school do so without a condom, and 86% say that when they're having recurring sex over the course of a year, that they still do not use a condom frequently. That does not sound like the pinnacle of sexual education to me, and does not fall under one of your criteria yourself. So you are arguing that this minute proportion of people is perfectly okay when they do it, which I'll perfectly agree to. If the resolution was we should not murder people, you're arguing that it's okay because self-defense exists. All right. Next, we have to get on to your other points. So first of all, the uniqueness of 18. So one, they don't have the same social pressures and things like standardized testing that they have in high school, because every person to some extent does need to go through that phase of self-discovery, but it is not necessarily significant to the people that are still in high school and in the social dynamic. So first, of people, you say they're revered in high school if they have sex. It's actually statistically not proven true. You have a significantly higher chance of committing suicide and becoming depressed if you have engaged in sexual relations while you're a teenager compared to those that practice abstinence, according to the Center of Disease Control in America. On top of that, you bring up that on an international level, America is just out of the water, the worst example compared to Australia. But we only have 8 more teen pregnancies per 1,000 people compared to Australia. Compared to other countries, it's normally in a range of about 10. So we're not that far out on the level of statistics. But at the end of the day, you really have to look at what my opponent's arguing for. He's arguing that these small, minute portions of people should continue to do what they're doing, which is perfectly fine. But that's proving the resolution true under my side, considering he's arguing that the 24% or the 30% or whatever statistics you want to pull from all land in my favor should continue to do what they're doing. And with that, I'll pass it over to you.
So again, this is the big problem with QallOut and using statistics, because people quote statistics and do not have any of the supporting logic behind it. For example, his discussion about the pregnancy rates in Australia are because we recently had a policy that gave teenagers and young people a significant amount of money if they got pregnant. That's not a function of the statistics. Additionally, as 10 is such a small number, enormous on the scale of statistics because it's per 1,000 people, and in a population of 300 million, you do the math, that's lots of extra people getting hurt. The thing I want to point to is that all the things he's talking about are specifically United States related and are not problems in any other countries, which means that if he wants to go to the preponderance of the evidence and a large group of people, the rest of the world is that large group of people, and the United States is the tiny minority that he says I'm defending. Secondly, he says people who practice abstinence are less likely to commit suicide. Yep, I've also read that study. It also demonstrates that people who are in that study, the teenagers who are practicing abstinence, are highly religious. And if you think about it, that makes sense, because normally religious people are the people who practice abstinence, and it's those religious people who have lower rates of suicide. So that has nothing to do with the abstinence. He's talking out of his ass there. I'm going to make some positive arguments. The first positive argument I'm going to make is why it's strictly good to take this opportunity when it is given to you. Firstly, you may never get another opportunity again. That is to say, you never know whether or not you'll have sex. You'll never know whether or not... No, I'm serious, because sex is one of the most important experiences that humans can have. Roll your eyes if you like, you're losing this debate. The next thing is that there's a pure enjoyment that you're getting. That is to say, sex is an enjoyable thing to do, and as a function of that, they're likely to benefit from it. Thirdly, it's a developmental experience. Even if that sex is bad, or even if it's something that you didn't enjoy at the time because you're a novice, that is just evidence to believe that you should practice in the future, / you've got this valuable information that you would not have otherwise, and then you can take that information forward. What are the harms of following out his plan? Firstly, you wouldn't get all of the benefits that I just demonstrated. Secondly, you would always be thinking, what if I had gone through with this? What if I had done this? And as a function of that, they're always questioning that. That is something that's likely going to distract them from their studies. Thirdly, there's a social harm. If you're presented with an opportunity with safe, enthusiastic, and consenting, and you do not act on that opportunity, the other person is going to think you're the weirdo. The other person is then going to do the things that Chandler said, say that you had a small penis, or insult you in the school ground, other than the lies that Chandler was talking about. Fourthly, there's active deprivation. What I'm talking about here is, regardless of the size of the group, there is a group of people, and I think it's a significant majority of people, presented with this opportunity all of the time to have enthusiastic, consensual, and safe sex. What Chandler is arguing is, in that circumstance, they should absolutely not be taking it. That is a ludicrous proposition. That's why you're voting con.
Okay, so to address some of Liam's points. First of all, he brings up that the USA and how the statistics strictly relies to religious people. The Center of Disease Control Statistics did not say. I will concede that possibly religion does play a part into these suicide statistics, but I think it's unlogical to say that accounts for the entire sum of the data should be cast out simply because there's the probability that these people might be religious. There's religious people commit suicide all the time. It's a fairly common practice, especially in the United States. So you talk about to start that this opportunity may never come again. Like, we're in a society where you have apps like Tinder, where sex is like shaking hands in most Western worlds and most first developed countries. So I don't think there's like a leg to stand on there, statistically speaking, that if they pass up this one opportunity to get laid when they're 17 or 16, that's never going to occur again in their entire life, especially when a very small portion of people actually die virgins. Next, you consider the social harm. My opponent's saying that by refusing to have sex, you are therefore putting yourself into a social trap, and the other person is going to there ridicule you. Well, first of all, if it's somebody that you're having a relationship with, you don't want to have a relationship anyway if they can't respect your wish to not have absence, or you don't feel prepared for sex. Second of all, I can't think in any situation where you're going to criticize somebody for making the best decision for them, both socially and medically. If somebody came to me and said I didn't have sex because I was afraid I was going to get an STDs, I respect them for that decision more than I'm going to crucify them socially. Next, you're talking about how you believe this is a very large percentage of people that follow your criteria of 3. But all the statistics I've lined out, both from the United States and the Australia Census of Bureaus, which I don't have to get into their study because they're already a very credible institution, disagree with you significantly. If only 10% of children or kids were not using condoms, then maybe that would make some sense that you're arguing from the majority basis. But when 30% in the United States and 45% in Australia don't use condoms on their first time, and then 86% of people in Australia do not use condoms repeatedly over their first year of having sexual activity with a constant partner, that is a big problem and shows a lack of education in both the United States and Australia that does not meet one of your criteria, Liam. And so if you really want to push the case that, oh, most people do this, you better come up with some statistics to back that up rather than pushing this arbitrary bullshit that doesn't actually make a stand in the case and with the resolution.
First thing I'm going to talk about is the thing that Chandler got a bit grumpy about at the end there, which is saying that a large proportion of people don't use condoms. The first thing I identify is that kids often lie on those surveys. That's why it's hard to determine whether or not many kids have had sex, because they often lie about it because it makes them feel socially acceptable. Secondly, you're just talking about one form of contraception. There are lots of other forms of contraception. For example, IUDs, cups, other things like that. So just because you're talking about one method doesn't mean all of the other methods are not taken into account. So I really think what Chandler's doing is taking a statistic that supports his side and then has not read it and then has just taken it out of context and just foisted it upon us, which is the problem with statistics in the debates. Again, I would ask, where is the foundational logic? What is the analysis of the sample size? If you can't provide that, you're just quoting numbers and it could be no different from the other one. The second thing he does is respond to my argument argument about never having sex again. He says that, people could go on Tinder. A couple of responses. Firstly, lots of people fail at Tinder all of the fucking time, bro. That's a pretty silly response. Secondly, even if you could get onto Tinder, there's a recognition that I made in my previous speech that was not responded to, that if you're passing up opportunities, you're missing experience, you're missing learning about what it means to be a sexual person and how to act in sexual situations. So without that information, you're less likely to have those opportunities in the future because you may have acted incorrectly. Thirdly, again, unresponded to is the social harm, that if you're an individual who is not acting in a way that you want to, that's likely going to result in everyone around you making fun of you. The next response he gives is to say, well, there's no reason that anyone would ever make fun of you for wanting to practice abstinence. I'm not talking about practicing abstinence. I'm talking about the person who wants to have sex in a safe, enthusiastic, and consensual way, but because Chandler has recommended to them that they should actively deprive themselves of one of the most foundational experiences of what it means to be a human, of something that could ruin their current relationship, of something that could ruin their social standing, they should then deprive themselves of that benefit. That is the lunacy of the pro side in this debate, and he has yet to defend it. Again, I would like to bring your attention to the fact that Chandler has actually still not defended the motion. He has only talked about circumstantial things around it. For example, education, which is different in other countries. For example, access to condoms, which is different in other yet to make an argument at the year 18 years plus, which is the motion. He is currently losing this debate because he has yet to defend it. And I ask him right now to make an argument about the year.
Okay, so to start, you talk about the lying on statistics and on contraceptions, just taking condoms out of place. Well, once again, in Australia, Australia Bureau of Statistics, less than 50% of women teen women go to the doctor to get pills or other forms of birth control. So once again, those numbers still not in your favor from a very credible institution. Next, you talk about you're missing out on the experience of having a sexual relationship. My question to you is, why is that is a unique benefit to people and exclusive to people that are 17 or younger? Why having sexual experience is important, no doubt. I will agree with you there. But why is that necessary for these kids that are 17 and younger? That's the question I have for you, Liam, because you can go and have a sexual experience and discover who you are sexually when you're 18 or older. It's not a drastic issue for the people. Also, when it's added with all the harms that I've brought up before, things like lack of education, things like the pressures socially in high school and how that can affect your life and has much more cataclysmic effects, on top of you having to worry about standardized testing, having to worry about applying for university and scholarships. That's the bridge point of this debate, is the age necessarily. And I'll talk about why 18 is beneficial for my side, because after 18, you're in a significantly different environment than when you're in high school. When you're past 18, you're normally in college, you're on your own, you make more mature decisions, you're able to actually go and experience things, you have accessibility to much more resources than somebody that is in high school and somebody that's still underneath this different social structure and is probably under a lot of pressure from these standardized institutions. So you say I didn't respond to your social harm, but I made a very, very big actually claim about it in my previous speech, which talks about nobody in their logical right mind is going to criticize you for saying I don't feel comfortable for having sex. If you're saying that me making a debate on QallOut is somehow depriving people of sex, I don't get that argument whatsoever. So I'd love for you to elaborate on that more. But it simply comes down to, at the end of the day, is there a unique benefit to having sex before you're 18 that outweighs all of the negatives I have brought up? And if my opponent wants to stick to his 3-point case that says, well, if these three, checks add up, then it's perfectly fine, then he has to show that that's the majority of the population. And once again, not a small, minute population in every single country in the world that we can, in the developed country in the world that we can find statistics for.
All right, so I'm going to repeat again all of the unique benefits of having sex under the age of 18 if it meets my criteria, of which he has not responded to. The first one I told you is that you may not ever get never get that opportunity again. He says there's Tinder. I give 3 responses, which he does not respond to. Rewind the video if you didn't hear them. Secondly, he said the second benefit I gave is pure enjoyment. Enjoyment at sex at different ages is different at different times. Thus, you would be missing out if you did not engage in it. Thirdly, the developmental experience. You get information about what it means to be a sexual person. person. He says, why can't I get that later? The response I have to that is that if you're waiting until college to get that information, everyone else around you has already had those experiences. Everyone else around you already expects certain things of you, and you're behind the 8 ball. You're the weird one, and you're the one who suffers as a function of that. He says he doesn't understand my argument with regard to depriving. I'm not saying that Chandler is forcing people to do something. I'm saying he's making a recommendation, and Chandler has it his way. Those children would accept that recommendation. Then the thing I'm saying is that of the group of people who are accepting this recommendation, the vast majority of them will be presented with opportunities to have safe, consensual, and enthusiastic sex that he has not responded to. And that means that those people would be actively depriving themselves of something that they would like to do. I'm not talking about the kid who wants to practice abstinence. I'm talking about the kids who want to engage in sex, but because of Chandler's recommendation, are not able to do so. He has yet responded to that, and I've repeated it again. The next thing he asked for is more unique things. Here are some more unique things as well. The first harm, he says, is to say, well, you know, when you're in at age, right? So he's finally made an age argument at about how many minutes is it into the debate. He says, you know, you have to do standardized testing. You've got to keep your GPA up, and there's social pressures. Bro, when you're in university, it's not as if like you have testing as well. It's not as if you have different competing social demands. The next thing he says is to say, well, people are more mature in college. Bullshit. People are the least mature in college. And the reason for that is they have gone from a very rigid structure in high school where they're told what to do 5 days a week, 40 weeks a year. Every minute of that day is scripted. When they go to college and university, they have to change the way that they're acting, and they get to choose, which means people lash out, which means people act recklessly, which also means that if they didn't have this experience beforehand, they're not going to have the information that will help them in the future, which means those sexual experiences in college after those shackles have been released are likely to be more unsafe, are likely to be less pleasurable, and are likely to be worse for the people engaging in them. Thus, there is another unique benefit to engaging in sex at an early age that none of which at this point has really been responded to, you judges.
So to start, you talk about, once again, people fail on Tinder and that they may never get this experience again. Center of Disease Control, less than 10% of people die virgins or undeclare that they've ever had sex to their partners. So once again, people, it's very unlikely, such a minute proportion, that they're never going to have sex again, because when they're a 17-year-old, they decided not to hook up with this chick after the football game. You talk about pure enjoyment and how they have to discover themselves sexually. Your argument that because they're not mature and they have to develop earlier does not actually make that much logical sense when you look at the actual facts of how there's different social dynamic. So you say how the people in colleges are less mature because mommy and daddy used to script their entire lives for them. That's absolutely true that mommy and daddy scripted their entire lives for them, but that's what makes them mature. They now have to go out and buy their own groceries, do their own laundry, work a job. That inherently makes them more mature because now they're more responsible for themselves and for their actions. Not to mention, once they're in college, they are guaranteed to have education on both sexual education and consent, which is something they do not have when they are in high school. Yet another benefit for why this age is important and significant to this. You talk about how it's just for the kids that want to do it and it's not for the other kids. Well, the majority of kids, once again, do not practice protection, do not use condoms, do not take birth control. On top of this, they have all the pressures that you talk about that you say aren't unique to high school students, even though in college, sure, you have finals for 1 week of the year, but in high school, standardized testing happens all throughout your senior year. Your GPA determines literally which college you're going to go to your first year, and most colleges don't let you transfer. So there are significant unique benefits to waiting until you're at least 18 and in college. At the end of this debate, I really want the judges to look at something. Is my opponent bringing up enough unique benefits, such as defining yourself and developing yourself sexually, that outweigh the significant harms of being in high school and having a sexual relationship, right? You have a better chance for things such as teen pregnancy and STDs, obviously, over the people that don't. And those can seriously ruin your life. Even if there's just a 1% chance they're going to do this, it's a better decision to wait overall.
I want you to notice something. Almost all of Chandler's arguments are relying upon the circumstantial evidence of education being bad in America. Literally the only developed country that does not have appropriate sexual education for primary and high school students. They are the anomaly. Any arguments based on that are ludicrous. Just across the border to Canada, they have a great sexual education program. In Australia, they do. In New Zealand, in Europe, everywhere else in the world. Arguments that are relying upon that are fundamentally unpersuasive. I'm going to talk about a couple of things. The first thing he says is that, well, very few people divergence. A couple of responses. Firstly, a lot of people are going to lie on that survey because it's embarrassing. Two, if that's the case, they could have got that from a prostitute. That doesn't mean it's from a loving, consensual relationship. Thirdly, it's different when it happens at 17 years of age. As I said in my previous argument, which did not hear a response, sexual experiences at different ages at different times mean different things. So when you're a teenager versus you're 25 versus postmenopausal versus having a child, these mean different things, and you're depriving yourself of that sexual experience. The next thing he says is that the vast majority of people don't use contraceptives. The first thing my criteria is not applying to those. But the second thing I would say is that seriously, Chandler, even if it is applying to those, think about the statistics you've used. You've said X amount don't use condoms, X amount don't use, the pill, and X amount don't use IUDs. What are those all together though? Because people who use condoms don't have to get a vasectomy. People who use the pill don't have to use an IUD, which means that of course there's going to be large proportions of people who aren't engaging in that practice because they're probably engaging in the other practice. Again, these are statistics from America. They would be a lot lower in Australia and Canada and every other country that has an appropriate sexual education program. You guys are the ones that are lagging behind the world, and it seems ludicrous that just because your government is shit and your government is fucking up this policy means that children should deprive themselves. Again, the next thing I would say is that we're talking about people who have an opportunity to enjoy this experience in a safe, consensual, and enthusiastic way, and this motion would deny them that. It would actively require them to deprive themselves of that experience and of that joy. That is a bad thing. Again, I want to respond to some things because he still has not yet responded to my responses about abstinence. Those are statistics that are taken of people who are from religious communities who already have exceptionally low rates of suicide compared to the population. And you want to know how I know this? Because there are very few non-religious people who practice abstinence, which means that study would be void in this case. About social pressure, he's confected something up and clearly doesn't have an understanding of how high school works. Those individuals who are engaging in sex are the people who are revered. And if you're the person who does not engage it when presented with the scenario and that you actively want to do it, you're the person who's going to be the outcast anyway because you're depriving yourself and you're depriving the person that you're with. This is silly.
Okay, so my first question to Liam would be, if America is this such terrible, sexual, uneducated monster that it shows, then why are also all these other countries, like Australia that you keep bringing up, Australian teenagers have a higher chance to not use a condom over the course of a year with their first-time partners than America? This is not an American exclusive issue. In Canada, 60% of teenagers don't use condoms the first time that they have sex. It is not an American exclusive problem, and therefore you are arguing for the minority and that only 24, 30, or 40% should continue to do something, which once again is a vote for pro, since we're agreeing that over 51% of the people that do it shouldn't do it because they're not safe under your own criteria. Next, you bring up that they could possibly be lying on the surveys, and this is just preposterous. So first of all, if you're going to agree that you had sex and put it on a survey, why would you lie and say that you did so without a condom? If anything, you'd lie on the survey and say that you did so with your condom just in case it got out and you wouldn't be ridiculed by your parents or the administration or something like that. It is ridiculous to disregard all the evidence that I've suggested on the fact that some students may have lied on this survey that they take. Next, my opponent goes to the extreme. He says 17 and 16, then he jumps to 25. You missed out on your sexual experience. No, Liam, that is not a valid argument in this case. You have to say why 17 is exclusively different than 18 or 19, because while 25 may be an extreme and there's a bunch of different variables there, you have to discuss the variables that are different from the 17-year-olds to the 18-year-olds in college.
Yeah, sure. You've misunderstood that argument. I was just saying at different years, it's worth different amounts. Thus, when you're 17 versus when you're pregnant versus when you're 25, you have different things. You fundamentally misunderstood the argument. That's embarrassing for you. And again, I want to repeat it because he has clearly misunderstood. The people who are saying they're not using condoms, particularly in Australia, perhaps, they're probably using other things like IUDs and the pill, which is heavily subsidized in Australia, which is virtually free for your first couple of months, which means that they probably wouldn't be doing this shit anyway. You're not listening to the argument. You're taking individual statistics without assessing the whole of those things. And again, I gave you a specific policy in Australia, which meant that our teen pregnancies was higher for the past 10 years. It wasn't before that fact. Literally, judges, he's totally missed the point. If you're presented with the opportunity to have enthusiastic, safe, and consensual sex, do it. have a good time, and don't let these bullshit statistics sway you to not enjoying yourself.
This will be my last little segment. So first of all, my opponent says it's different for different people. He is yet to point out why 17 and 16 is extremely different than 18. If anything, 18 would be a better number because you're in college and you have more freedom and you don't have all the social pressures I had before, and you're guaranteed to have education, which even in Australia apparently isn't good because they still have the same issues. And he talks about the pill and how it's basically free in Australia. Then why do less than 50% of women in Australia use the pill? I'm just going to wrap this up and summarize real quick. Overall, these teenagers have major disadvantages to doing this. A very small, minute portion meets my opponent's criteria, and therefore you should vote pro. Judges and audience, and Liam, thank you.